Hey and welcome back. This today is one of the most important films I have ever made. I've been researching what really happened at the Rendlesham Forest incident for many years. Everything pointed me in the direction of understanding what was going on at a facility called Cobra Mist. This joint UK and US Air Force military radio laboratory is only a few miles from Rendlesham Forest, from Woodbridge, from Bentwaters. Looking behind the curtain, understanding what really went on at Cobra Mist might well unlock the mystery of what really happened at the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident. It's no good trying to research what actually occurred without looking at the big picture, looking at the politics and the weaponization of physics during the Cold War. There's two classic quotes, this from Nick Pope. Understand what really happened at Rendlesham and you understand the real nature of UAP. And this from Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. It's not aliens and you can't tell the people. So today, viewers, let's look at a key player in the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident. The facility called Cobra Mist. So as a filmmaker, how do I tell you about what I've researched and learned about the facility Cobra Mist? I could just sit down and share some of the things that I've learned, but no. For 2 years, I've been trying to persuade a senior British radio technology engineer to tell you what he knows. And today he agreed to be recorded and share with you first-hand information about what Cobra Mist really was and how 7 years after its closure, it was still the key player in what actually happened in the Rendlesham Forest incident. Hey everybody, this is a momentous moment. I've been waiting to have this interview for over 2 years. What we're going to discuss today changes everything. It's very important that you listen to this wonderful gentleman who is very kindly come on the show today to talk specifically about his knowledge, his information, and about Cobra Mist specifically. So Peter, over the years, who have you worked for and what kind of size of projects have you been involved in?
I've actually been involved in projects like LOFAR, which is low frequency array, Square Kilometre Array, which are two very large European projects. And I've been working with universities that are working on this project together. So I've been designing hardware and not a software engineer, I'm only a hardware engineer. And been involved in some quite interesting radio astronomy projects, not only in Europe.
Let's dive into Cobra Mist. Cobra Mist is a code name for a station that was built on Orford Ness in Suffolk on eastern England, overlooking the North Sea and pointing towards the Soviet Union. We were told, as British citizens and the world, that Cobra Mist was a radar station. Let's talk a bit about British radar facilities in the Cold War. Why do you think Britain needed Cobra Mist? I mean, what radar facilities did Britain actually have? And is it likely that it was a radar?
Well, you have to look at the development during the Second World War and after the Second World War. After the Second World War, there were very large developments. Neater's Head, the big radar system on the coast, very, very close to Orford Ness. Also, RAF Fylingdales, which was basically three big golf balls. Right. One was transmitting and two were receiving.
Right.
and they were part of the BMEWS system, ballistic missile early warning system from the Americans, and
Right.
they were looking very, very, very deeply into Soviet space. So very important installations, all after the Second World War.
All right. So a radar station in Suffolk, an extra one. I mean, as you mentioned, Neatishead Head is only about 50 miles from the Cobra Mist site, and Fylingdales is just up the road on the east coast. And of course, Britain was part of NATO. So why would Britain need a radar station that covered Germany, Denmark, Belgium? I mean, those countries must have serious radar systems themselves.
Yeah, obviously. With the Dutch had their radar systems, the Germans had their radar systems. There's one very big one, which is very, very close to Bonn, which used to be the capital city.
Yep.
And obviously, you got countries like Sweden and Norway. They were also involved with the IceCat system that was actually not as civilian as people think. Its main interest was obviously military. The French had their systems as well.
Yeah.
There was NATO and there was OTAN, and the French had their systems.
Right.
The UK was basically an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Americans.
Right.
And the Americans wanted to have, by their dear buddy and friend, the BMEWS system, which was RAF Fylingdales. So that's the reason for having that one. The Neatishead Head system was UKLF, United Kingdom Land Forces,
right.
and was there as an extra radar system. Obviously, the British radar network goes all over the place. There's RAF Bulmer in the northeast of England, and it was all part of the system. So Britain had their own radar system, the Americans had their radar system, and the British system and the American system were working together. So we really were well covered with radar. And the Orford Ness system, there's really no explanation for it as a radar system.
We're told that Cobra Mist was this kind of radar called over the horizon, or we've already established that we had over the horizon because we had radar systems in Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Germany. So it would have to be a system that would look deep into the Soviet Union.
Over the horizon radar systems, what they usually do is they have a transmitter site, and it transmits and uses the ionosphere as a reflector, which then looks much, much deeper than a normal radar system can see. And this system obviously is so powerful that it has, in different locations, it has its receiver stations. So looking at Orford Ness as a transmitter, you don't see any receivers near it. That is the very interesting thing with Orford Ness. Just basically looking at the design of an OTH system. The Russians obviously had their system, which was had the nickname of the Woodpecker, and it was by Chernobyl and used the nuclear power station by Chernobyl for the power that was needed. And it was also in a location where no one was there, because the power was so high, it would basically have killed people or seriously caused biological problems. So that's the reason why these radar systems, they don't have receivers co-located.
Oh, right. So that's a bit of a giveaway. So Orford Ness, Cobra Mist, if it was a genuine over-the-horizon radar system, would maybe be its transmission system, but somewhere inland, multiple miles away, there would need to be a receiver. Is there a Cobra Mist receiver?
Correct. And it doesn't necessarily need to be the same design as the transmitting antenna. It can be something totally different. But it would have to be a very big installation. And this is obviously does not exist in the UK, never did.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to jump to the end of the story, which gives a massive, interesting clue to what Cobra Mist might really have been. So Cobra Mist existed. We're told it's an over-the-horizon radar. Is it? That's the question. It mysteriously closed down at 1730 Zulu in June 1973. Bang, and it was switched off. A number of the technicians who worked there worked for the UK MOD as in the role of being civil servants. They were monthly paid, and they filed a works tribunal case against the sudden closure of this Cobra Mist building facility that they were working in. That story got into the national press, and the national press asked the MOD press officer, what's this Cobra Mist thing? We're running a story about the Works Tribunal. Do you have a photograph of it? And they did. They sent this overhead shot of the Cobra Mist antenna and control zone, and it was published in national newspapers. Tell me the story, Peter, today of your friends and colleagues that you heard when they saw the picture. These were people who know what they're talking about. What did they say?
Well, obviously, they're very experienced engineers who were used to designing high-power transmitter systems, radar systems, and knew everything worldwide because it was their job. As an engineer, you need to know what the competition is doing. And what they basically said was, hey, this thing is incredibly weird. The antenna design, it cannot be for radar. And the way it's looking here, it looks as if it's firing in the wrong direction. So this was the first indicator that there was something very, very weird going on. Later, pictures appeared of the actual antenna close-up. And colleagues saw these pictures and said, no way. There is... On the antenna elements, there are like little springy bits on the end. And they are used to stop ionization on the tip of the antennas in the atmosphere. Basically, if you ionize the air around the transmitter, all the signal stays where it is and doesn't get radiated. So this is an indicator of extremely high power. It's never ever been seen anywhere worldwide since these pictures were presented, and that's basically what we all saw as an indicator for it not being radar, over the horizon radar, of it very, very clearly being a non-nuclear electromagnetic pulse weapon.
Oh, well, that changes history. That is very interesting. So what's a non-nuclear EMP pulse weapon?
Well, I'm going to try and keep the technical bits as small as possible.
Yep.
But what you have to realize is if you have a large amount of energy stored in something called a Marx generator, it's the antenna that takes this energy and transmits it over a very wide or a very small bandwidth. And also, the antenna doesn't transmit everywhere a bit of energy in all directions. It concentrates the energy in one direction only. And the pictures that appeared from the Orfordness station, you see the switching room, which is above ground. What it basically does is they select an antenna section to be used to discharge an electromagnetic pulse towards Europe. What basically the idea was, if the Soviets ever invaded Europe, we would know where they were coming from. So it was a case of a last resort. You fire a non-nuclear electromagnetic pulse directionally to wipe out the Soviets in one area.
When you say wipe out the Soviets, you're not talking about humans. You're talking about communication, computers, radios. I mean, we know about EMP that it's a massive discharge into the atmosphere which grounds through equipment and equipment that normally runs on 5 or 12 or even mains voltage fries. Was that the idea?
An EMP will basically wipe out all the electronics, all the electrical systems, and everything which is in the area where the EMP is directed, basically to throw the whole area back into the Stone Ages. If you are close enough to the EMP generator, it will obviously see the nerve system of the human being as an antenna, and it will burn out your nerve system, so killing people. But you'd have to be a lot closer.
Yeah.
The system was designed to wipe out technology.
That sounds a very serious and dangerous type of weapon system. You've talked about these high power antennas that we've seen in pictures. How on earth would a weapon system in Suffolk, England, be powered? I mean, wouldn't it need some kind of serious power supply? Is there a power supply that it could have made it work?
It's an interesting question, isn't it, Simon? Well, all you got to do is you've got to look at a much lower powered system, the Duga radar system that the Russians actually built and used for many, many years, which was by Chernobyl. It was actually by Chernobyl, so it could get the electrical power that it needed. Well, you go to the UK, Sizewell A power station. It was totally and utterly overdimensioned. It was the biggest nuclear power station that was at the time built. And it was basically arse end of the world on a shingle bank on the edge of England, miles away from chemical industry or electrical or steel industry. Big users of electrical power. You just don't put power stations away from their users unless you have another reason for doing it. This was to power the EMP weapon, which was the systems in Orford Ness.
Well, it's a very viable theory because, I mean, Sizewell A was, in fact, when it was built, first designed in 1955 and made operational in 1963, was not only a power station, it was the world's biggest nuclear power station. And as you've said, it's in rural Suffolk. It's 139 miles from the nearest grid interconnect. They needed to put in very large pylon systems. It didn't even have a railway line going to it. And as you said, Peter, it was built on a shingle bank on the east coast of Britain, which just a few years earlier was terribly flooded. I mean, talk about a bad place to build a power station. No people, no industry, hundreds of miles away from even the interconnect to the British CEGB supergrid. But ironically, right next door, you can see in this picture both the facilities, Orford Ness with Cobra Mist, whatever it was, and Sizewell nuclear power station. Today, Sizewell has Sizewell B, and then they're proposing Sizewell 3C. So it's a serious site.
Another interesting thing with the Orford Ness location, if you look at the grid planning, they had an 11 kV connection, and at its absolute peak, I think it had a 33 kV connection, and because it was the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment as well, and this part of the grid is well documented. Having a power station next to Orford Ness, which produced 260 megawatts of power. This is one hell of a lot of energy, and it's just the kind of thing that you need for an EMP weapon system. So that explains easily the co-location.
We've got pretty good evidence from your colleagues and experts that the shape and design of the antenna wasn't an over-the-horizon radar system. So if it was this mythical non-nuclear EMP pulse weapon system, how do you make the pulse? How do you actually produce the energy, even if it's connected to Sizewell, to actually make a pulse that can fire across the North Sea and into the Western Europe to stop a Soviet invasion?
Well, what you've got to do is you've got to basically store energy. And the next factor is the discharge time, where you get all this energy to leave the capacitor. So it's not only getting the energy from Sizewell A, it's also being able to discharge the energy. And how they did it was using something called a Marx cell.
So a Marx generator was first invented in Germany in the 1920s, and it's a way of stepping up voltage to make a discharge from multiple capacitors. How do you charge it up and how do you discharge it?
Okay, that's pretty simple. What you've got is you've got capacitors that are all charged via resistors, and the resistors allow a slow charge. So they're all in parallel.
Right.
And they're all getting charged from the same source.
All building up.
So, all building up. So they've now got a spark gap in front of them. And this spark gap is a higher voltage than the actual charge voltage of the capacitor.
The gap needs a higher voltage to close the gap. So the capacitors are charging up until they can overcome that gap.
Correct. So what you're now doing is you are using the first capacitor and using something called a triggertron, which is also used in atomic weapons detonation.
Yeah.
You have the possibility of switching very, very, very fast. So what now happens is the first capacitor is connected to the second capacitor, and you now have double the voltage.
Bang, bang.
And this is now double the voltage for all the rest of the spark gaps in the whole of the Marx generator array. What it is the instantaneous discharge of all energy from all capacitors, but this time in series. So you've now got an amazingly high voltage. And the whole energy is being discharged in an incredibly short time. We're talking about picoseconds. So this is the high voltage together with the energy that is being discharged in such a small amount of time. That is basically the generation of a non-nuclear EMP.
And would this device be at Sizewell, or would it be in the control center of the Cobra Mist building?
Obviously, the Marx generator needs to be very, very close indeed to the antenna and the antenna beam switching unit. So the Marx generator is obviously under the Cobra Mist array. And because of the amount of power that is generated and the discharge time, you can't go over a transmission line. A transmission line is a delay line. So you cannot have the transmitter building somewhere near the antenna. It then has a feed line going to the antenna. That's not how it works. So the Marx generator has to be directly under the Cobra Mist array. There is a building which is very close. And this building is on stilts, and it's basically a Faraday cage. So make a little bit of a think. You've got human beings with nerve systems, and they're the operators. So you cannot have them near this EMP generator when it is fired, or they will all be killed. So that is the explanation of the room, the building on stilts, which is a Faraday cage on stilts. It's there to protect the personnel who are operating the system.
Is there any evidence that it was tested? And also, wouldn't we, NATO, also need to be protected from its own pulse?
You're getting onto an interesting question, Simon. To test such a system, it's easy. You just don't use many Marx generators. You only say use two together. and you charge them at a much lower level. So now when you discharge, you've got the energy has been dramatically reduced.
Right.
What they had at this time was people who were having serious problems in the area. We're talking about television reception, which wasn't really all that much of a problem.
No.
But we had people with things like the early generations of pacemakers, and they were having serious problems with this system. Actually, it went as far as local government, which went up to Margaret Thatcher. But obviously, when it was needed in the case of war to thwart the Russians, all they needed to do was to connect a large number of Marx generators together, to connect the charging circuits, and to charge them from Sizewell A. So you've now got this massive amount of energy which is being transmitted in a beam from Offerness, which can be directed to any position in Europe. If the Soviets decided to come in via Finland or Norway, no problem. The antenna could be switched to go there. You see by the fan array that are now the ruins, the remnants of the construction. You see exactly what the beam angles were, what the directions were. So now you've got a really big problem. You've got NATO partners, and the NATO partners say, oh, if this thing can wonk out the Russians, it can wonk us out as well, because we are closer to Offerness than the Russians are. Right. So what was basically circling in NATO circles, Strategic Headquarters Allied Forces Europe, SHAPE in Belgium at this time, they were saying, oops, this is a last resort weapon, but the Russians have got thermonuclear EMPs, which they can use to wipe out Europe. Right. But also, if we are first with the unit in Offerness, it means that everything by NATO in the beam is also wiped out. So that was actually the true reason why this high energy project was cancelled, and why it was miniaturized and made portable.
Oh, okay. All right. Whoa. That's very interesting. I've certainly come across financial statements saying during that period, EMP protection for NATO buildings, forces, and equipment was stepped up. Here's a photograph of a building in Germany that's got the classic Faraday EMP protection. There was funding to do it because not only to protect against a Russian nuclear EMP, but maybe to protect against our own Cobra Mist weapon, which could be fired in anger if the Russians invaded Western Europe.
If you look at Europe and Europe only, you will find in building code regulations for electrical installations and for buildings, you will find the protection class A, which is basically just throw a net over the building. Wow. And when you make something out, a high-rise building using steel in your concrete, rebar, you're obviously making a cage as well. So if you put anything outside the cage, like an air conditioning system on the roof, it needs to have a net thrown over it. So that's the class A. The class B and C are discharge units, which discharge very, very fast, high energy pulses on the electrical cables coming into the building. So we've now got the class A, the class B, the class C. They are standard building code regulations in the whole of Europe for many, many years. So this was civilian design from NATO trying to combat the effects of Russian thermonuclear bomb EMP devices. So that is very, very visible even till today. And by the way, it even protects from local lightning strikes, which is very good for the insurance companies. They don't have to pay money if you've got to invest in the building code regulation ABC So
sure.
they're very, very happy with it as well.
But I go further than that and say that, sure, we need lightning protection and we need Soviet EMP nuclear protection. But if there's a device in Suffolk, England, that could zap Western Europe, it would be prudent that NATO countries protected themselves from Cobra Mist.
Correct. But what you do not realize is the power level from a directed EMP is much, much higher. So protection would work a little bit, but it wouldn't really be all that effective. Please remember the Russians specialized in nuclear weapons that they dropped from aircraft, which came down on parachutes. And when they exploded, they put their energy like in a ball direction everywhere. So everything that went up had no effect on NATO or Europe. Everything that went down went everywhere. So it wasn't concentrated. So that's the difference between Russian EMP weapon systems and NATO EMP weapon systems. Because the NATO EMP weapon system was highly directional and extremely high power. So you've got to imagine with this in NATO, your NATO partners start doing their tactical analysis and say, hey, look, this thing's great, we've got it, but it's too dangerous. It's going to kill us as well. So they went over to the development of portable EMP weapon systems. And the British manufactured this because they were obviously experts, together with the Americans, because the Orford Ness Cobra Mist project was also in conjunction with the Americans. And they manufactured portable systems that were in sea containers. They were actually in smaller sea containers. So you could put a NATO sea container inside an international sea container and you could hide it. So when you wanted to get them out, all you did, pull them out, put them on a lorry and use them. Well, our system was stationed in Bielefeld in Germany. And there were Royal Engineers trained to be able to deploy the system. And it was obviously highly directional. That's the way they put the antenna up, manually planting the poles in a direction using a compass, and then putting the system together. And to charge it, they went down in power and down in frequency bandwidth. So they kept the frequency bandwidth much smaller. So they didn't need the energy from a nuclear power station. So I have heard they actually had a very long charging time using diesel generators.
And still had the Marx generators.
Yeah, the containers were the Marx generators, and they were just bolted together. So the interesting thing is, I can't believe that. So there must be somewhere in the German electricity grid where it was possible to connect this weapon system if ever it was being needed.
Locations where you could a very big 3-pin plug over the all right, Peter, that is really fascinating. I mean, the thing that's important about Cobra Mist is that it was in Orford Ness, it was in Suffolk, and we've hinted that also that there is an effect from Cobra Mist coming back into Suffolk. I think when it was tested, there's evidence that people were mildly affected or worried about it. And certainly the GPO of the BBC fitted chokes on people's UHF TV antennas. So, I mean, we know that this actually existed.
So the interesting thing with Cobra Mist, when they tested it, they obviously needed to see what the beam pattern was in Europe. So they went much, much lower in power. And this was causing interference to televisions and obviously to pacemakers. But this was in test mode with a very small amount of power, which obviously meant that if Cobra Mist was ever used The main energy would have got on the main lobe out to the front, but there is something called a back lobe by every antenna, and this back lobe would have gone across the UK with extremely high power and would have knocked out large amounts of facilities in the UK as well, not only the Soviets. So that is another interesting piece of knowledge that contributed to them scrapping Orford Ness. They realized if ever they were to use it, yeah, it would do its job great, but the back lobe of the antenna would wipe out large amounts of the UK as well.
Right.
And it was directly next to the antenna, not over the other side of the channel in Europe with a large distance. It was very, very close.
Well, it was very close to some place called Rendlesham Forest, Bentwaters and Woodbridge, and also Martlesham, where possibly the research into miniaturizing a non-nuclear EMP after Cobra Mist closed actually carried out, their research was done there, maybe. Who knows?
I know that in the 1980s, there was this fully developed portable EMP weapon system stationed in Bielefeld with the British Army of the Rhine. I know that. So the development of a portable system had to take place after closure and obviously before this time. So this was developed in the British research area, which you're talking about. This is obviously the only place they would do it. So the facilities there are obviously, even till today, for research into high energy weapons. And obviously when they're going to do later, much later, they're actually going to do a full-blown test. This is obviously where they're going to do it, which brings together your people who've been injured by the United States Air Force. It's very logical.
Well, the connection between the Cobra Mist technology and the injuries at Rendlesham Forest are a bit of a mystery, but I think somehow connected because what people often forget is that the forest backs onto the backside of where Cobra Mist was and still backs onto Orford Ness, Bordsey, and is just the other side of Martlesham. So it seems quite logical to me that the Rendlesham Forest, British woodland, forestry commission, scrubby land with no people, sandwiched between two US Air Force bases, might well be a very good place to at least test and experiment with systems that were in development during the Cold War.
So you're now looking at things like Orford Ness, which was closed down, but the Sizewell A underground high voltage power line. I think you told me once there is in Bentwater under a hangar, they have a connection point to this high voltage grid. This obviously makes a great deal of sense. If you're experimenting with high energy pulse systems, well, you make one in the form of Cobra Mist, but you've obviously got your research facilities. So when you're planning the power supply for your research facilities, you're obviously not going to dig a cable to Orford Ness and stop. You're going to look at the other areas which are known for British military high energy weapon research and radar research. All these locations are there. And don't forget another interesting little thing that a lot of people are forgetting. All the scientists and engineers that are working on these systems, they've got wives and kids, haven't they? And they want to be home in an evening to have their evening meal with their kids. So you're not going to have these people going every single day from the south end of Devon, to Orford Ness area to work every day. So obviously these people are going to be also there. They're going to be concentrated in one area, which means this is the reason pointing again to this area being used for weapons research. And you look at the research facility from the post office and other research facilities. They've got their clever people and they want to be home in an evening with their kids, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, the Martlesham Heath GPO or British Telecom Lab was obviously also a military laboratory. It's known as Adastral Park, and Plessy and maybe Marconi and lots of other people had, buildings in that laboratory area. One of the interesting stories about the closure of Cobra Mist is that the US Air Force and Britain, who collaborated on the system, hired an outside consulting company called Stanford Research International, or SRI, to advise them about its operation. And they were part of a team who advised them to close it down. But the interesting thing is, I hear that they stayed on in the Suffolk area, possibly having a new laboratory for them at Adastral Park, which is the Martlesham Heath facility. And there's a lot of stuff that needs to be uncovered, and there's a lot of possibility that these systems not only were potentially lethal, but might also work at frequencies that might attract the highly strange or phenomenon as well. It's a very interesting area of research.
As a senior design engineer with a lifetime's experience, seeing the most amazing stuff. I was even involved with the Gesellschaft für Schwerionenforschung in Darmstadt. And they made heavy ion therapy, which can treat non-operable brain tumors. I see things that are not public knowledge. Right. And it's just absolutely fantastic what physics is actually developing. And it's like the Teflon pan, right. Which is the thing people get from space flight. Well, it wasn't only the Teflon that they got. It was millions of other things as well. And most people just don't know about these things.
Sure.
And that's pretty interesting. You've got this wonderful community today in the internet. It connects people with knowledge. Mm-hmm. Well, they haven't published anything in the internet, so it's not available. It's also got information in the internet, right. Which is great. You don't need to go to a library anymore. It's right. At your fingertips. But it's also got a lot of information that is not in the internet. Mm-hmm. It's the big mistake kids make today. They think the internet knows everything. No, it doesn't. No. Massive amounts of knowledge have never been put into the internet. Right. So that's an interesting thing in our lives, to see the information that's been discovered. Totally. And has never really been disseminated to people.
Well, I just really have to thank you very much, Peter, because it's people like you who are open-minded enough to share your years of experience, your years of knowledge, when you can see something which basically the British government was economical with the truth about, by seeing a photograph, by discussing it on a YouTube channel, we start getting to a bigger truth. And none of this is classified information. This all happened over 45 years ago. Cobra Mist was closed down in 1973. The British MOD press officer told me personally I can talk about anything to do with the Rendlesham Forest flying saucer because it's all speculation. What we've done today is not speculate. We've listened to the knowledge of an expert who actually looked at the Cobra Mist system and understood it. Thank you, Peter. What you said today is absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much, Peter. I hope you viewers found it as informative as I did. In part 3 of this series, I will explain to you how EMP technology was used in Rendlesham Forest and how human advanced physics got out of hand, summoning the highly strange. Thanks for watching this, folks. Leave any questions you have in the comments and subscribe for part 3, because the truth needs to be out there.